The torpedo runs straight and true beneath the enemy transport, carrying 2,000 Japanese soldiers toward Guadalcanal, and then it passes directly underneath without exploding. The submarine commander watches through the periscope as his weapon, the weapon the United States Navy promised would end this war faster, becomes nothing more than a shadow beneath an enemy hull that continues steaming toward American Marines who are outnumbered and dying on a beach they were told to hold. He fires again. Same result. The weapon his country spent millions developing, the weapon that was supposed to give America's submarines the edge in the Pacific, performs exactly as designed in every way, except the one that matters. It does not kill. And somewhere in Washington, in offices far from the periscope and the waiting and the rage, men who wore uniforms with more brass than salt water already knew these weapons were broken. They knew before the first patrol. They knew before the first empty-handed submarine limped back to Pearl Harbor with a crew that no longer trusted their own equipment or the institution that issued it. But they sent them anyway. How many American submarines were sent into combat carrying weapons that the Navy already suspected would fail? And how many enemy ships escaped because someone decided that admitting a mistake was more dangerous than letting the war drag on? July 1942. The USS Tenosa sits silent in the Pacific, 200 miles south of Truk, one of the most heavily fortified Japanese naval bases in the theater. Commander Lawrence Daspit has been tracking a target for hours, maneuvering his submarine into perfect firing position, and now through his periscope he sees something submariners dream about, a massive Japanese tanker, the Tonemaru No. 3, 19,000 tons of fuel oil and aviation gasoline steaming alone without escort across open water. This is not a cargo ship carrying rice or ammunition. This is a vessel carrying the lifeblood of the Japanese war machine, the fuel that powers their aircraft carriers and battleships, and the Zeros that strafe American positions from Midway to the Solomon Islands. Sinking this ship would cripple Japanese operations for weeks. Daspit does everything by the manual. He closes to optimal range, sets depth for a hit beneath the waterline where the explosion will break the tanker's back, calculates the target's speed and course with precision that would satisfy any instructor at the submarine school in New London. He fires. The first torpedo runs hot, straight, and normal. The crew counts the seconds. Through the periscope, Daspit watches the wake close the distance. The torpedo strikes the hull of the Tonemaru exactly where he aimed. Nothing happens. No explosion. No plume of water. No fire. The tanker continues on course, as if the most advanced naval weapon in the American arsenal had been nothing more than a floating log that bumped against its side. Daspit cannot believe what he has just witnessed. He fires again. Same result. A hit, a dull thud that echoes through the Tenosa's hull, and then nothing. The tanker does not slow, does not turn, does not show any sign that it has just been struck by a weapon designed to tear open steel plate and detonate hundreds of pounds of high explosive inside an enemy hull. Daspit fires a third torpedo, a fourth, a fifth. Each time the crew hears the impact, each time the target survives. He empties nearly his entire load, 15 torpedoes in total, every one of them a perfect shot according to every tactical manual the Navy had written. 13 strike the Tonemaru. 11 hit directly beneath the waterline in the kill zone that should have sent the tanker to the bottom within minutes. 2 explode. 11 do nothing. The crew of the Tenosa stands in the control room, listening to the sound of their weapons hitting an enemy ship over and over again without effect, and they begin to understand that something is fundamentally wrong with the weapon they have been ordered to trust with their lives. Daspit makes a decision that will later define his career and his relationship with the Navy command structure. He saves his last torpedo. He does not fire it at the tanker. He brings it back to Pearl Harbor as evidence, a live round that will be dissected and examined and tested, proof that the problem is not his aim or his crew's competence or bad luck, but something in the weapon itself. The Tonemaru escapes. It delivers its cargo of fuel to Japanese forces, who will use it to attack American ships and bases and troops across the Pacific theater. And Daspit returns to Pearl Harbor carrying a question that the Navy does not want to answer. If 15 perfectly aimed torpedoes cannot sink one unarmed tanker, how is the United States supposed to win a submarine war against Japan? The Mark 14 torpedo was supposed to be the weapon that would strangle Japan. Before the war, before Pearl Harbor forced America into a fight it had spent years trying to avoid, Naval strategists understood that any conflict in the Pacific would be decided by logistics and supply lines stretching across thousands of miles of open ocean. Japan was an island nation that imported nearly everything it needed to sustain a modern military. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Indochina, steel and coal and rice from Korea and Manchuria. Cut those supply lines and the Japanese war machine would starve regardless of how many aircraft carriers or battleships it had anchored in Tokyo Bay. American submarines would be the blade that performed the strangulation, and the Mark 14 torpedo would be the edge on that blade. The Navy had spent nearly 2 decades and millions of dollars developing this weapon, and on paper it represented the pinnacle of naval engineering. It was faster than previous torpedoes, capable of 46 knots, fast enough to catch most merchant vessels and many warships. It had a range of 4,500 yards at high speed and could travel more than 9,000 yards at lower settings, giving submarines the ability to fire from safer distances and still hit their targets. Most importantly, it carried a magnetic influence exploder, a technologically sophisticated detonator that was supposed to revolutionize naval warfare. Instead of relying on contact with an enemy hull, the Mark 14 would sense the magnetic field of a steel ship passing overhead and detonate beneath the keel, where the explosion would create a bubble of gas that would break the target's spine and send it to the bottom far more efficiently than a simple hole in the side. This was the theory that had been refined in laboratories and on testing ranges, the innovation that was supposed to give American submarines an insurmountable advantage. When the Mark 14 torpedoes were loaded into submarines heading out on patrol in late 1941 and early 1942, commanders were told they were carrying the most reliable and deadly torpedo any Navy had ever produced. The weapon had been tested, evaluated, and approved by the Bureau of Ordnance, the branch of the Navy responsible for all weapons development and deployment. Submarine captains received their weapons with the understanding that if they followed doctrine, if they calculated their firing solutions correctly and positioned their boats properly and executed their attacks according to the manual, the Mark 14 would perform exactly as designed. The expectation was total confidence. Commanders were expected to trust the weapon as much as they trusted the steel hull that kept the ocean from crushing them at 300 feet. But from the very first patrols of the war, reality contradicted expectation in ways that could not be explained by human error or bad luck. Submarines fired torpedoes at stationary targets and missed. They fired at slow-moving cargo ships from point-blank range and watched their weapons pass harmlessly beneath the hull. They achieved perfect firing positions against high-value targets, enemy aircraft carriers and cruisers and troopships, and then watched those targets sail away untouched while their torpedoes either failed to explode or ran deeper than set or detonated prematurely hundreds of yards short of the target. Commanders returned from patrols and reported these failures to their superiors, expecting that the Bureau of Ordnance would investigate and correct whatever flaw existed in the weapon. Instead, they were told the problem was their execution, their aim, their depth settings, their understanding of the equipment. The weapon was fine. The weapon had been tested. The weapon was not the problem. And so submarines continue going out on patrol carrying torpedoes that did not work, and the Navy continued insisting that they did. The Tenosa was not the first submarine to return with a story about torpedoes that refused to sink enemy ships, and it would not be the last. In the first year of the Pacific War, the failure of the Mark 14 torpedo repeated itself with such consistency that it became impossible to dismiss as coincidence or operator error. Yet the pattern was treated by the Bureau of Ordnance as if each incident existed in isolation, unconnected to the others, each one an anomaly that proved nothing about the weapon itself. Commander Howard Gilmore took the USS Growler into the East China Sea in April 1942 and achieved a textbook attack on a Japanese convoy. He maneuvered into position, calculated his firing solution with the precision of a man who had spent years training for this exact moment, and launched a spread of torpedoes at a cargo ship that was moving slowly and predictably across his sights. The crew counted the seconds until impact. They heard the explosions. 2 of them. But when Gilmore raised the periscope expecting to see a ship breaking apart and sinking, he instead saw the target continuing on course with minor damage to its bow, smoke rising from a fire that the crew was already fighting, the hull intact, and the vessel very much afloat. He fired again at a second ship in the convoy. Same result. Explosions that sounded promising, damage that looked superficial, and targets that escaped. The Growler returned to base having expended most of its torpedoes, and having sunk nothing of significance. Gilmore filed a report describing the failures in detail, noting that the torpedoes appeared to be detonating prematurely or striking the target without enough force to achieve a kill. His report joined dozens of others that were accumulating in filing cabinets at Pearl Harbor and in Washington. In August 1942, the USS Guardfish under Commander Thomas Barney encountered a Japanese seaplane tender off the coast of Truk, a slower and more vulnerable target than a warship but still a valuable enemy asset that supported reconnaissance operations across a wide area of the Pacific. Barney fired 6 torpedoes in a carefully planned attack, for missed entirely despite firing solutions that should have guaranteed hits. 2 struck the target and failed to explode. The seaplane tender escaped without serious damage. Barney returned furious, insisting that either his torpedoes were defective or the depth settings were catastrophically wrong, causing the weapons to run too deep and pass beneath enemy hulls without making contact. He was told to review his procedures. The USS Wahoo under Commander Dudley Morton became one of the most aggressive submarines in the Pacific Fleet, and Morton's willingness to close to knife-fighting range with enemy ships made him a legend among submariners who admired his audacity. But even Morton could not overcome the failures of the Mark 14. On one patrol, he fired at a Japanese destroyer from less than 1,000 yards, close enough that missing should have been nearly impossible. The torpedo ran directly beneath the destroyer without detonating. Morton fired again. Same result. He repositioned and fired a 3rd time, and this torpedo finally exploded, but the damage was insufficient to sink the target, which limped away trailing smoke while the Wahoo withdrew before Japanese escorts could close in for a counterattack. Morton returned to Pearl Harbor and told anyone who would listen that his torpedoes were junk, that the magnetic exploder was unreliable, that the depth settings were wrong, and that the Navy was sending submarines into combat with weapons that were getting men killed by failing at the worst possible moment. His complaints were noted and dismissed. The pattern extended beyond individual submarines. Entire wolf packs reported similar failures. Submarines operating in different parts of the Pacific, firing at different types of targets under different conditions, all described the same problems. Torpedoes running too deep, torpedoes failing to explode on contact, torpedoes detonating prematurely in the magnetic field of a target before they reach the hull. The consistency of these reports should have triggered an immediate investigation and a halt to combat operations until the weapon could be fixed. Instead, the Bureau of Ordnance continued to insist that the Mark 14 was functioning as designed and that the failures were the result of improper use by submarine crews who did not fully understand the sophisticated technology they had been issued. By the end of 1942, American submarines had fired hundreds of torpedoes at Japanese shipping and had achieved a success rate so low that it threatened the entire strategic concept of the submarine campaign. Enemy convoys continued delivering troops and supplies across the Pacific. Japanese logistics remained intact. The weapon that was supposed to strangle Japan was failing, and the men who depended on it were beginning to understand that the problem was not going to be acknowledged or fixed by the people responsible for putting it in their hands. The Bureau of Ordnance did not discover the Mark 14's failures after the war started. They had warnings before the first torpedo was ever fired in anger, warnings that came from the submarine crews themselves and from tests that revealed fundamental flaws in the weapon's design, and those warnings were systematically ignored or suppressed by the very institution responsible for ensuring that American submariners went into combat with reliable equipment. Commander Charles Lockwood, who would later become commander of the Pacific Submarine Fleet, began receiving failure reports from his captains as early as January 1942, barely a month after Pearl Harbor. These were not vague complaints or excuses from men trying to justify poor performance. These were detailed accounts from experienced commanders describing specific incidents where torpedoes behaved in ways that contradicted everything the Bureau of Ordnance had promised. Lockwood collected these reports and forwarded them to Washington with his own observations and recommendations for immediate testing and evaluation. The Bureau of Ordnance responded by defending the weapon and questioning the competence of the submarine commanders filing the complaints. The magnetic exploder, which was causing many of the premature detonations, had never been properly tested before the war. The Navy had conducted limited trials, but those tests were performed under artificial conditions that did not replicate the magnetic variations found in different parts of the Pacific, and they were conducted with such concern for secrecy and cost that live-fire tests against actual target hulls were never performed. The Bureau knew the magnetic exploder was improving technology being deployed in a combat environment where failure would cost lives and missions, and they issued it anyway, because admitting that the weapon needed more development would have meant admitting that years of research and millions of dollars had produced something that was not ready for war. Submarine commanders began conducting their own unauthorized tests because they could not trust the official assurances they were receiving from Washington. In June 1943, officers at Pearl Harbor took a Mark 14 torpedo and fired it into a fishing net suspended at a known depth. The torpedo ran 11 feet deeper than its depth setting indicated. They fired another. Same result. They fired multiple torpedoes at multiple depth settings and discovered that the Mark 14 consistently ran deeper than set, which explained why so many attacks against shallow draft targets had resulted in weapons passing harmlessly beneath enemy hulls. When these test results were sent to the Bureau of Ordnance, the response was not gratitude for identifying a critical flaw, but anger that submarine officers had performed tests without authorization and had dared to suggest that the weapon was defective. The depth-running problem was eventually acknowledged, but only after months of pressure from the fleet and after countless missions had failed because submarines were firing torpedoes that were traveling through the water in the wrong place. Even after the depth issue was corrected, the contact exploder continued to fail. Torpedoes that actually struck enemy hulls often failed to detonate because the firing pin mechanism was too fragile and would crumple on impact instead of triggering the explosive charge. This flaw had existed in the design for years, but it had never been caught during testing because the Bureau of Ordnance had never fired live torpedoes directly at target hulls at the angles that would occur during actual combat. The tests that might have revealed the problem were considered too expensive, and so the flaw remained hidden until submarines discovered it the hard way, by hitting enemy ships and achieving nothing. Some commanders wrote letters directly to the Bureau describing these failures and requesting answers. Those letters were filed away. Some threatened to refuse to take their submarines on patrol with defective weapons. They were told they would be relieved of command if they did not follow orders. The institutional response to evidence of failure was not investigation or correction, but denial and suppression, because acknowledging that the Mark 14 was fundamentally broken would have required the Bureau of Ordnance to admit that it had failed in its primary responsibility and had sent men into combat with a weapon that did not work. That admission would have had consequences for careers and reputations, and the credibility of an entire branch of the Navy that prided itself on technical excellence. And so the warnings were ignored, the tests were dismissed, and the submarines kept going out on patrol carrying torpedoes that everyone in the fleet knew were defective, but that no one in Washington was willing to fix. The cost of the Mark 14's failure cannot be measured only in torpedoes that did not explode or enemy ships that escaped. The real cost was paid by the submarine crews who went into combat knowing their primary weapon was unreliable, by the commanders who had to choose between following doctrine that did not work or disobeying orders to save their crews, and by the thousands of American servicemen across the Pacific who continued fighting a longer war because the Navy's submarines could not cut Japan's supply lines the way they were supposed to. Submariners began to doubt themselves before they doubted their equipment. When a torpedo failed, the first instinct was not to blame the weapon, but to review the firing solution, to question the mathematics, to wonder if the depth setting was wrong or the angle was off or if some small error in calculation had caused the miss. Men who had trained for years to become submarine commanders, who had proven their skill and judgment and courage, began to second-guess every decision because they could not trust the outcome. They returned from patrols having fired at perfect targets under perfect conditions and having achieved nothing, and they faced the psychological burden of wondering if they were simply not good enough, if some flaw in their execution was causing the failures that everyone else was also experiencing. This doubt eroded confidence and morale in ways that enemy depth charges and aircraft never could. The USS Sculpin went on patrol in November 1943 under Commander Fred Conaway. The boat was attacked by Japanese destroyers after a torpedo attack failed, and in the chaos of the counterattack, the Sculpin was forced to the surface where it was shelled and destroyed. 42 men died. Conaway went down with his boat. The survivors were captured and transported to Japan aboard an aircraft carrier, and during that transport, the carrier was torpedoed by another American submarine, the USS Sailfish, which had no way of knowing it was condemning its own comrades to death in the hold of an enemy ship. 21 of the Sculpin survivors died in that attack. The chain of events that led to this tragedy began with a torpedo that did not sink its target, forcing the Sculpin to remain in an area where it was eventually hunted down and destroyed. The Sculpin's loss was not unique, but it illustrated how the Mark XIV's failures created cascading consequences that cost lives in ways that could never be fully accounted for. Submarines that should have sunk enemy transports instead allowed those transports to deliver troops to battlefields where Americans were fighting and dying. The USS Harder under Commander Samuel Dealey achieved one of the most aggressive and successful patrols of the war, stalking and sinking multiple Japanese destroyers in a single operation. But even Dealey faced the frustration of torpedoes that malfunctioned at critical moments, forcing him to take risks in close to ranges that no submarine commander should have to accept. Dealey survived that patrol, but he was killed in action later in the war during another high-risk engagement, and the question remains whether those risks would have been necessary if the Mark XIV had worked the way it was supposed to from the beginning. There were commanders who gave up. Men who had spent their entire careers preparing to lead submarines in combat requested transfers to surface ships or shore duty because they could no longer accept the burden of going to sea with a weapon that betrayed them. The Navy lost experienced leaders not to enemy action but to institutional failure, and those losses weakened the submarine force in ways that statistics could not capture. The sailors in the torpedo rooms, the men who loaded and maintained and armed the Mark XIV torpedoes, carried their own kind of burden. They knew the weapons were defective. They heard the stories from other boats. They saw the looks on their officers' faces when another attack failed. And they went through the mechanical routines of checking and preparing the torpedoes, knowing that all their work might result in nothing more than a dull thud against an enemy hull and another entry in a failure report that no one in Washington would take seriously. The human cost was also measured in opportunities lost. Every Japanese troop ship that escaped because a torpedo failed delivered soldiers who would kill Americans on islands across the Pacific. Every tanker that survived carried fuel that powered Japanese aircraft that strafed American positions. Every cargo ship that made it through carried ammunition and supplies that sustained enemy forces for weeks or months longer than they should have been able to fight. The war in the Pacific lasted longer than it needed to, and while no single weapon failure can be blamed for the length of that conflict, the cumulative effect of thousands of torpedo failures over years of combat meant that American submarines did not achieve the strangling effect on Japanese logistics that pre-war planners had envisioned, and that failure extended the war and cost lives in ways that can never be precisely calculated, but that were nonetheless real and devastating. The Mark XIV torpedo was eventually fixed. By late 1943, after nearly 2 years of combat failures and mounting pressure from submarine commanders who refused to stay silent, the Bureau of Ordnance finally acknowledged the depth-running problem, deactivated the magnetic exploder, and corrected the contact firing pin design. American submarines in the final years of the war achieved the success rates that should have been possible from the beginning, sinking Japanese merchant shipping at a pace that crippled the enemy's ability to sustain its military operations. But the fixes came too late for the commanders who were relieved of duty for complaining too loudly, too late for the crews who died in submarines that were forced to take unnecessary risks because their primary weapon could not be trusted, and too late for the thousands of American servicemen across the Pacific who fought a longer and bloodier war because Japan's supply lines remained open during the critical early years when the Mark XIV should have been cutting them. The institutional failure that allowed defective torpedoes to remain in service for 2 years was not the result of ignorance or accident. It was the result of a bureaucratic system that valued reputation over reality, that prioritized the protection of careers and the avoidance of embarrassment over the lives of the men who depended on its weapons to function. The warnings were available. The evidence was documented. The submarine commanders provided detailed reports that described exactly what was wrong and what needed to be fixed. And all of it was ignored because acknowledging the failure would have required powerful people to admit they had made a mistake. And in the hierarchy of the United States Navy in 1942, protecting institutional prestige was more important than protecting the men at sea. The question that remains is not whether the Mark XIV torpedo failed, because that failure is documented and undeniable. The question is how many other failures were buried in the same way. How many other weapon systems were issued to American forces during World War II with known defects that were never corrected because the institutional cost of admitting the problem was considered too high? How many reports were filed and ignored? How many warnings were dismissed? How many men died not because the enemy was stronger or smarter or better equipped, but because the institutions responsible for supporting them decided that reputation mattered more than truth? The Mark 14 torpedo was fixed because submarine commanders refused to stop complaining, and because the evidence of failure became too overwhelming to suppress. But it was fixed by the fleet, not by the Bureau of Ordnance. It was fixed by men who conducted unauthorized tests, and who wrote angry letters, and who risked their careers to force an institution to confront a reality it did not want to acknowledge. And if those men had not fought that fight, if they had simply accepted the official assurances and stopped questioning the weapon they were given, the Mark 14 would have continued failing for the entire war, and the cost in lives and lost opportunities would have been immeasurably worse. The institutional indifference that allowed the Mark 14 to fail for 2 years did not disappear when the torpedo was finally corrected. That indifference is structural, embedded in systems that prioritize hierarchy and reputation over accountability and truth. And it raises a question that has no comfortable answer. If this failure could be buried and ignored for 2 years during the largest war in human history, what other failures were never discovered at all?